For 10 years, one image was burned into the minds of millions of viewers. A white cargo van rolling down a gravel road somewhere in the Midwest. Two men inside, one behind the wheel, the other leaning toward the window, squinting at a rusted heap of metal in someone's overgrown yard. It was the opening shot of a Monday night ritual for American Pickers fans, and it never seemed to need explanation. Mike Wolfe drove. Frank Fritz rode shotgun, dry-witted, unimpressed by most things, lit up by select few. That rhythm carried the show for over a decade. Then, in the spring of 2020, the passenger seat went quiet. No send-off. No farewell episode. No statement laying out what had happened. Frank Fritz simply stopped appearing, and the show kept airing as if nothing had changed. Fans noticed within weeks. Online communities filled with theories. Some assumed a money dispute. Some assumed ego. Some assumed Mike Wolfe had simply decided he didn't need his old friend anymore. None of those theories were close to correct, and it would take years and Frank's death before the real story came out in full. This is that story. Not a rumor, not a leak, not a secret tape. Just the truth about a man whose body and mind were quietly falling apart behind a persona that looked steady on camera for over a decade. Frank Fritz grew up in Davenport, Iowa, a river city built along the banks of the Mississippi. Exact details of his early life are harder to pin down than you'd expect from someone who spent a decade on national television. His birth year is reported differently across sources, somewhere between 1962 and 1965, and Frank himself never made a point of settling the record. That kind of quiet privacy about personal details would turn out to be a pattern that followed him his entire life. What is consistent across every account of his childhood is the habit that shaped his future. As a kid, he collected rocks, then beer cans, then stamps he'd spread out on the table for his father to inspect. He'd go through rolls of coins looking for anything that seemed older or different from the rest. By his teenage years, he was walking the railroad tracks outside town, picking through what transient rail riders had left behind at their makeshift camps. Where other people saw garbage, Frank saw objects with stories attached to them, and he wanted to know what those stories were. It was during those years that he met another kid with the same instinct, a boy named Mike Wolfe. Both of them came from homes where their fathers weren't especially present, and both had found something like comfort in old, discarded objects. That shared understanding became the foundation of a friendship that would stretch across more than 4 decades, survive a very public falling out, and ultimately end in a hospice room with one of them holding the other's hand. After high school, Frank took a practical path. He spent roughly 25 years working as a fire and safety inspector around the Des Moines area, a steady job that also happened to put him on the road constantly, driving through towns where he kept stumbling across old firehouse memorabilia, vintage signage, and pieces of Americana that fed his hobby without him ever intending it to become anything more. Then one deal changed the math. He picked up an item cheap, flipped it for several $100s in profit, and realized the hobby could be a living. In 2002, he left the inspector job and opened Frank's Antiques in Savannah, Illinois, betting on an eye for value he had been sharpening since he was a teenager walking train tracks. The show that would define the rest of Frank's life almost never happened. Mike Wolfe spent 5 years trying to sell the concept, 2 guys traveling the country, knocking on doors, digging through barns and sheds in search of forgotten pieces of American history. Discovery passed on it. TLC passed on it. Even the Smithsonian reportedly showed no interest. It wasn't until 2009, riding the wave of success from Pawn Stars, that the History Channel finally said yes. American Pickers premiered on January 18, 2010, and pulled in 3.1 million viewers, the network's biggest series debut since Ice Road Truckers in 2007. The History Channel had only ordered 10 episodes to start. By the end of that first season, the show was averaging 3.8 million viewers a week, and what had been a 5-year-long pitch nobody wanted had become one of cable television's biggest surprises. What made it work wasn't just the concept. Plenty of shows have tried the same formula and failed. It was the chemistry between 2 very different personalities. Mike gravitated toward motorcycles, signage, and the big headline finds. Frank had his own lane: toys, oil cans, vintage advertising, anything tied to old American brands. Danielle Colby held down the home base at Antique Archaeology in Eau Claire, Iowa, giving the show a place to return to between road trips. And Frank brought something the show genuinely needed: an easy, unforced warmth. He didn't push sellers. He didn't perform excitement he didn't feel. When he lit up over an old Honda or a vintage Harley, it read as real because it was. Over 11 years, Frank appeared in 308 episodes. To millions of viewers who tuned in week after week, he felt less like a television personality and more like someone they actually knew. In a strange way, they weren't entirely wrong. A decade of unscripted, low-key moments does create a kind of familiarity. What none of those viewers knew was that a second, much darker story had been running underneath the one they were watching the entire time. While cameras captured Frank calmly, sorting through decades-old junk piles, his own body had been fighting him for just as long. He had lived with Crohn's disease, a chronic, incurable inflammatory condition of the digestive tract, for more than 3 decades by the time the show made him a recognizable face. In interviews, he described it as maddeningly unpredictable. Some days he could eat anything without consequence, and on other days something as simple as a piece of toast could trigger a flare severe enough to derail his entire day. Managing that condition while working a physically demanding job that involved climbing into dusty barns, lifting heavy objects, and spending long stretches on the road in a cramped van was its own quiet act of endurance, one that never made it into the show's storyline. At the same time, his spine was deteriorating. Years of physical strain had caused serious spinal stenosis and disc degeneration, and by the time it was properly diagnosed, a surgeon reportedly described his condition in stark, alarming terms. His back was close to giving out entirely. The surgery required to address it was extensive. Doctors placed 2 metal rods running the length of his spine, and Frank came out of the operation with 185 stitches. Publicly, he insisted the surgery had worked, that he could still bend and lift and do the physical work that had defined his adult life. But recovery from that surgery landed at the worst possible moment, the early months of 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic shut the world down and left Frank isolated, in pain, and with nowhere to go and nothing to distract him. He had been prescribed opioid painkillers as part of his recovery. Somewhere in that stretch of isolation and physical pain, prescribed medication turned into dependence. And that dependence didn't arrive in a vacuum. It landed on top of a body already managing Crohn's and a mind already carrying a long, complicated relationship with alcohol. When Frank eventually spoke publicly about his struggles with alcohol, he was clear about where it came from. His mother struggled with alcoholism for most of her life and died from alcohol-related causes around 2016. His grandfather had died the same way. Addiction wasn't a new visitor in Frank's family. It was something he had watched move through multiple generations before it ever became his own fight. In 2021, after getting sober, Frank spoke to reporters about the progress he'd made, going through rehab, losing more than 60 pounds, and reaching nearly a year without drinking. It was a genuine accomplishment and one he seemed proud of. But it came after a public low point that made his private struggle impossible to keep private. On the night of July 30, 2017, Iowa State Police received multiple 911 calls reporting a vehicle driving the wrong way on Interstate 80. The truck belonged to Frank. When an officer pulled him over near Walcott, Iowa, Frank appeared disoriented, drifting in and out of awareness. He admitted to having consumed both alcohol and Xanax, though he later told reporters he had taken the medication the day before the stop for anxiety, not the day of. He also pointed out something true about his situation. That living in the public eye meant every mistake got magnified. The legal outcome was fairly light, a deferred judgment, a year of unsupervised probation, a fine plus court costs, and a mandated substance abuse evaluation. But the practical consequences went beyond the courtroom. A DUI was now part of his public record, and for a man already carrying a family history of addiction, already tried to get under control, that single fact changed how the outside world was able to read the rest of his life. He did get sober afterward, and he talked about it honestly in interviews. Then came the back surgery. Then came the pills. And the fight he thought he had already won came back in a different, more dangerous form. Frank's final episode aired in March of 2020, the same month the country began shutting down. At the time, his absence looked entirely explainable. He had just gone through major spinal surgery, and recovery from an operation like that takes real time. Nothing about the silence suggested a permanent departure, and Frank himself didn't think it was one. In interviews during 2021, he said plainly that he expected to return once he'd healed, that he was just waiting on the right conversation with the network to send him back to the van, the back roads, and the work that had defined more than a decade of his life. That conversation never came. Instead, new episodes kept airing with other people rotating through the passenger seat, while fans kept asking the same question with no real answer. The network stayed vague. Mike Wolfe stayed vague. And Frank stayed in Iowa, recovering from surgery, managing pain, quietly taking medication he wasn't talking about, and waiting for a phone call that wasn't coming in the shape he expected. Eventually, an online campaign to bring him back gained enough traction that both the History Channel and Mike Wolfe had to respond. Wolfe wrote that Frank was like a brother to him and wished him well. In July 2021, the History Channel confirmed Frank would not be returning to the show. From the outside, it read like a simple story, a falling out, maybe a firing, maybe a contract dispute that got personal. What was actually happening was far heavier, and only one person close to the situation understood the full shape of it. That person chose, for years, not to say anything at all. By the summer of 2021, the gap between the story Frank was telling himself and the story building around him in public could no longer stay separate. In interviews, Frank finally addressed the silence directly. He said he hadn't spoken to Mike in 2 years. He said Mike knew about his back problems and had never reached out to check on him. He said the show had shifted its focus toward Wolfe, and he framed his own position as pushed to the margins. He even compared his situation to being the overlooked member of a famous band and suggested Mike intended to replace him with his own brother. It was pointed, specific, and hard to ignore, and the public reaction split predictably. Some viewers sided with Frank, feeling he'd always been underappreciated on a show that bore both their names. Others thought he sounded bitter, especially if his exit had ultimately traced back to his own health and choices. Nobody outside a small circle had the full picture. In July 2021, Wolfe responded publicly, calling Frank a brother and saying he was dealing with a lot and wishing him well in the next chapter of his life. Frank dismissed the statement, insisting it hadn't sounded like something Mike would actually say himself. What the public didn't know, what Mike Wolfe knew and deliberately chose not to reveal, was that the man giving those interviews wasn't speaking from a fully clear place. Addiction was shaping those words as much as Frank was. Wolfe could hear the difference, even if audiences couldn't, and he made a conscious decision to let the simpler, more damaging story about their friendship stand rather than expose what Frank was actually going through. It wasn't indifference. It was protection, and it came at a real cost to how Wolfe himself was perceived for years. It wasn't until Frank had already died that Wolfe explained any of this publicly. In interviews given in late 2024 and again in early 2026, he described how during Frank's recovery from spinal surgery in 2020, in the middle of a lockdown, isolated world, the pain treatment spiraled into a genuine opioid addiction, the kind that reshapes how a person sees the people around them and puts words in their mouth that don't fully reflect who they are. Wolfe said he understood how harsh public judgment can be, and that once he and Frank reconnected, forgiveness came easily because he recognized how much of what had been said during that period came from the addiction rather than from Frank himself. For months before their estrangement became visible to the public, Wolfe had quietly been trying to get Frank into treatment. He stayed in contact. He pushed privately without ever making it public, because doing so while Frank was still alive and still fighting would have meant exposing his friend's struggle to the world without his consent, something Wolfe considered a real betrayal of trust. So he absorbed the public blame instead. He let people call him cold, arrogant, and indifferent, and said nothing that would have corrected the record, because correcting it would have meant sacrificing his friend's privacy for his own image. On July 14, 2022, Frank was found on the floor of his Davenport home, unable to move or call for help. A friend discovered him, and by the time he reached the hospital, the damage from the stroke was severe. He spent roughly a month hospitalized. In August 2022, friends filed an emergency petition asking a court to appoint a temporary guardian and conservator, describing how badly the stroke had impaired his ability to manage even the basics of daily life: food, shelter, clothing, and medical care. His longtime friend Chris Davis was appointed guardian, and a bank was appointed conservator to oversee an estate worth close to $6 million. The physical toll was severe. The right side of his body was largely paralyzed, and his speech was significantly affected. Between 2022 and 2023, he was hospitalized for additional times, dealing with pneumonia and seizures. When he eventually returned home, his farmhouse, the one he bought back in 2010 as the show was taking off, had been fitted with a wheelchair ramp because that was now the only way in or out. His monthly medical costs reportedly climbed to nearly $28,000, a large portion of that going toward in-home care, totaling well over $250,000 a year. The man who had spent his life finding value in objects other people discarded was now, in the most literal sense, entirely dependent on the people around him. The reconciliation between Frank and Mike happened over Memorial Day weekend in 2023, and the detail that matters most is who initiated it. Frank did. A mutual friend, who chose not to be publicly identified, arranged the visit after Frank told her directly that he wanted to see Mike. She later said this had never really been the bitter feud the public assumed. In her view, the two men had simply needed time and distance to understand what they actually meant to each other. When Wolf visited him at the care facility, what happened bore no resemblance to the public narrative that had defined the previous 2 years. The two men cried. They talked about old times. Wolf pulled out his phone and showed Frank photos of recent finds, speaking to him in the language that had connected them since childhood, the objects, the stories behind them, the thrill of finding something worth saving. Frank, whose speech had been badly affected by the stroke, leaned in and listened. Wolf kept coming back after that. By his own account, he was there, holding Frank's hand, when Frank took his final breath. Frank Fritz died on September 30th, 2024, at the age of 60, in a hospice facility in Davenport, Iowa, the same town where his story began. The official cause of death was listed as a late sequela of cerebral infarction, the medical term for long-term complications following a stroke, with cerebral vascular disease named as the primary contributing condition, alongside aortic stenosis and COPD. Crohn's disease, the illness he'd quietly managed for 30 years, remained part of his medical history until the end. When Wolf announced Frank's death, he finally said openly what he'd spent years protecting. He said he wanted people to know, and that Frank would have wanted them to know too, that they had loved each other like brothers, and that a friendship like theirs comes along once in a lifetime. The boy who once walked the train tracks outside Davenport looking for what other people had left behind ended his story in that same town, beside the friend he'd met while sorting through discarded junk more than 40 years earlier. The road that led there was far darker than most of his fans ever understood. Disease, addiction, a devastating stroke, and years of silence that looked like a falling out, but was actually one friend trying, quietly and at real personal cost, to protect the other. In the end, the friendship found its way back, even after everything that had tried to break it apart.